You are listening to Vanguard Elements, the alternative Mexican-American voice of the Southwest. The views and opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the individual expressing those views and opinions, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any affiliated organization, employer, or institution. Thank you for supporting independent Mexican-American media.
Throughout much of the 2026 gubernatorial primary campaign, Xavier Becerra struggled to gain traction in California's crowded race for governor. In fact, as late as March 13th, Becerra seemed hopelessly mired in single digits and was polling at a meager 5%. It seemed at the time like it was just a matter of time before Becerra suspended his campaign for governor altogether. By May 30th, however, just days before the primary, Becerra had managed to establish a commanding lead in the race for California and was polling at an impressive 28%. And although the results of the California gubernatorial primary are still being processed, as of June 4th, it appears reasonably certain that Becerra will be facing off against Trump-endorsed Republican Steve Hilton in the general election in November. We'll be back in a moment to discuss the political resurrection of Xavier Becerra and a range of related issues. You are listening to Vanguard Elements.
You are listening to Vanguard Elements, the alternative Mexican-American voice of the Southwest. Vanguard Elements is available on a range of platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Castbox, Deezer, Podcast Addict, and Podchaser. Thank you for supporting independent Mexican-American media.
Welcome back. This is the Vanguard Elements podcast. My name is Aldo Mena, and I'm joined tonight by my co-host, Steve Ciañez, the Senior State Policy Strategist for Unidos US in California. He's joining us tonight from the Los Angeles area. And I'm also very pleased to be joined tonight by George Galvis, the Executive Director of an organization called Communities United for Restorative Youth Justice, also commonly referred to as Courage. Mr. Galvis is joining us, if I'm not mistaken, from somewhere in the Bay Area. Welcome to the podcast, George. I really appreciate both of you guys taking the time to join the conversation tonight.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, George. Thank you, Aldo, for having us. And let's go ahead and kick it off, man.
Absolutely. Okay, so George, to start the conversation tonight, would you mind telling us a little bit about Courage, the nonprofit organization that you run?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what I can say about Courage is we were born over 15 years ago. We were born out of the gang injunction organizing of Oakland. My co-founders were defendants in the Fruitvale gang injunction. And at the time, we began organizing against the gang injunctions in Oakland. We were being very cognizant, not just about what we were saying no to, but what we're saying yes to. We said no to gang injunction zones that criminalize particularly Black and brown young people, but yes to this concept that we are introducing of youth power zones to take a strength-based asset mapping approach to how we deal with our young people that are caught up in the criminal legal system. So, we believe those close to the pain are close to the solution, and that we're the experts of our own lives. So, fast forward to where we are today. We completely own, like no mortgage note, no debt or anything. 17,000 square feet right there in the heart of Fruitvale, in the Transit Village area by Fruitvale BART station of East Oakland. So, we have a staff of 30, and we serve thousands of young people each year and their families. In fact, just every month, just in one program through our food justice program, we feed 4,000 families between Fruitvale and West Oakland. So, we've sponsored over 50 bills in the state of California that have been signed into legislation. I'm proud to say that probably just about every criminal justice, juvenile justice, police accountability, school discipline legislation passed in California in the last 15 years probably has our fingerprints on it. And we've sponsored a number of ballot initiatives. So, we were some of the core architects for what became Proposition 57, and we became the first direct file state in the nation to eliminate the very toxic practice and problematic practice of district attorneys charging youth as young as 14 years old as adults with adult prison sentences going to adult prison. And so we became the first state with direct file in the country to eliminate that practice. And so, our current campaign that we've been running for some time is this idea of really just being unapologetic, unbroken, and uncompromising about what our North Star is, and that's to dream beyond bars. So we unlock the leadership of young people to dream beyond bars. We say close youth prisons, build youth leaders, education, not incarceration. And so that's a little bit about what we do. And just disclaimer, that is my day job. And that is a 501c3. So as a 501c3 as an organization, we don't endorse candidates, but I'm also the executive director of our 501c4, which is the Dream Beyond Bars Action Fund, in which I can endorse candidates all day. You know what I'm saying? So that's the hat I'm wearing today.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. Just real quick, I know during our pre-production conversation, you mentioned that you've actually worked directly with Gavin Newsom. Could you say a few things about that? How did you cross paths with Governor Gavin Newsom?
Yeah, so actually, I think you guys are familiar with what's been referred to as the ad hoc Latino, alliance. It's like a California group of, it began initially with maybe about a dozen nonprofit leaders, representing many of the largest kind of Latino-led organizations in the state of California. I was probably the youngest person in that group, and I ain't a spring chicken no more, man. But nevertheless, it was mostly older, and most folks running very large, long-established organizations. So I was probably the baby, also in terms of budget size and staff and whatnot. But nevertheless, I was invited to the table. So I was honored by that invitation. And initially, when Governor Newsom was first elected, our role was to really advise him in making sure that there were Latinos that were appointed to different state boards and commissions, and that we wanted to make sure that as one of the largest groups in California, that those appointments reflected the diversity of California. Because for too long, we've been one of the majorities of California, but yet we don't necessarily see that reflected in our leadership.
Interesting. Steve, I kind of have a similar question for you. How did your work kind of bring you into proximity with Xavier Becerra? I know you sent me a picture once of you and Javier kind of hanging out. How did you cross paths with Mr. Becerra?
My man, Xavier Becerra. It was part of the job that I do. We work closely with the Latino caucus, the Latino Legislative Caucus of California. And so we were going to have a annual event, and we were invited as part of Unidos to deliver a keynote speech in which our CEO and president, Janet Murguia, addressed everyone there, all the Latino Legislative Caucus members. And so at this event, Xavier Becerra was there as well. And we crossed paths, and we just started talking, and we had a good conversation. At that moment, it was back in December. He wasn't rising. It was more like he was going nowhere with his campaign. Eric Swalwell had just jumped in and broken through. So it seemed at that time that Becerra just had no chances of really getting ahead in that race. And so that's where we met. We talked, and we had a great conversation. And, I'm not going to say that I gave him advice on how to win this race because, obviously that's too much. But we did have a conversation, a small conversation about the race itself. And listening to the man, he's an intellectual. He's very, very smart, but he's also very down to earth. He's a good guy, man. He's just, we were, code switching. By that I mean we were using Spanglish, going back and forth with Spanish and English. Just I felt so at ease with this man. And I felt like, wow, I mean, this guy is a great candidate. He's a great person. He's a great human being. And I just don't understand why he's not doing as good in the polls as, as he should be. And of course, I had already met some other candidates like Tony Thurman, which is also, he's a very charismatic guy. But there is something about a Becerra that really struck me in a very positive way. And so, yeah, that was my experience with him. And so we sat and at the same table, we had dinner, we drank a little bit, here and there, and then we took some pictures. And we promised to stay in contact. So yeah, so that's the way I ran into him, and we kind of crossed paths, and our friendship kind of developed there. Yeah.
Interesting. Just one final question for you, George, and Steve, feel free to chime in if you'd like. How did you guys cross paths exactly? How did you guys run into each other or meet each other?
But we met through that ad hoc Latino network, which is, since that time has expanded. And I also just kind of go back to your original question, because I want to make sure that, your audience doesn't necessarily misunderstand also my connection and relationship to Governor Brown, which is, I'm not a fan. So I want to be clear about that. I think I was cautiously optimistic when he was initially elected. And I did participate in that group. We did make recommendations in terms of appointments for Latino representation in boards and commissions for the state. But I recalled him as someone, I was born and raised in San Francisco. My family goes back generations in San Francisco, right? And I've been in Oakland since 1996. So I say I was a Frisco raised, Oakland made, you know what I mean? But because of my deep roots in San Francisco, I remember him when he was on the board of supervisors. And he was this young kind of frat boy kind of guy who kind of rode around with the Getty family, rich oil family, right? Mm-hmm. The billionaires and the elite of San Francisco, and was very much focused on criminalizing poverty and the homeless people, kind of similar to what we're seeing happening right now, and was really trying to build his career on that. When he ran for mayor, the person who ran against him, I'm trying to remember his name, is like Jeff Gonzalez. He was a board of supervisor. He was kind of like the young progressive guy on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. I believe he's now in the public defender's office. But at the time he was on the Board of Supervisors, and he decided to switch parties from the Democratic Party to the Green Party. And I think that was probably a fundamental, mistake in terms of strategy, because the DNC then was very fearful of like a Green candidate becoming a mayor of a major city in this country. And, Ralph Nader had just also kind of ran a campaign that threatened the Democratic Party. So they paraded Bill Clinton in. They raised a ton of money for him. And then when the election was over, they found a bunch of ballot boxes representing my neighborhood in the Mission District, which was expected to vote very progressive, so not necessarily for Newsom, and Bayview Hunters Point. And they found them dumped in Lake Merced. And so those votes were never counted, but somehow they disappeared. And so that, I think, was the catalyst for Newsom's career. You know what I mean? Later on, he became lieutenant governor, and people who know lieutenant governors are pretty much in California insignificant. But when he came into the governor's office, I was initially cautiously optimistic, because one of the things that he said, which mattered a lot to me, was he said that he was going to end youth incarceration in California as we know it. And so that gave me a tremendous amount of hope. I think over time, we've seen him kind of flip-flop on positions. We've seen him kind of move himself more and more towards the right to try to appease, I think, to the old Republican Party. At the same time that he's also, I think, spent a lot of time and energy focusing on this very sort of bromance, sort of rivalry between him and the orange fascists in office. You know what I mean? The way they kind of clap back at each other. I mean, right. I almost tell them not to tell them to get a bedroom. You know what I mean? Because it feels, like they're feeling each other a little too damn much. You know what I'm saying? So, right. But I did want to just kind of clarify that, yes, there have been some things that Brown has done that I'm grateful and supportive of, and there's been a lot that, especially in the second term, that I'm just not a fan of.
Right. At some point we're going to circle back and have a lot more to say about Newsom here very soon. At this point, guys, let's take a quick
got plenty to
break.
Say about Becerra too, so just tag me in, let me know, because I'm ready to go on Becerra.
That's coming real soon. Okay, sounds good. So let's take a quick break, guys. We'll be right back to continue our conversation. You are listening to Vanguard Elements. Welcome back. This is the Vanguard Elements podcast. I am joined tonight by Steve Sianes and George Galvis. So let's go ahead and start the conversation about Xavier Becerra. Although the results of the California gubernatorial primary are still being processed, it's probably going to take about a month to actually certify the primary. Uh, I think we'd all agree that it appears reasonably certain as of June 4th that Xavier Becerra will be facing off against Republican Steve Hilton in the general election in November. This wasn't always the case, though, right, gentlemen? Throughout much of the 2026 gubernatorial primary campaign, let's be honest, as much as I was kind of rooting for Becerra, it just didn't seem like he was going to, break out of the pack or whatever. It was clear that he was struggling to gain traction in California's very crowded race for governor. In an article featured in SF Gate on March 13th, for example, Becerra, who at the time was mired in single digits, was identified as one of the, quote, lingering Democrats. At that time, Becerra, the former California Attorney General and Health and Human Services Secretary in the Biden administration, was registering a mere 5% of likely voter support, according to the Politico poll being cited in the article. By mid-April, in the aftermath of now former U.S. Representative Eric Swalwell's kind of, stunning downfall and subsequent withdrawal from the race, Becerra, started to poll slightly higher. I think he was polling at 10%. And he had managed to clear the polling threshold to participate in the gubernatorial debate scheduled for later in April. But even at this point, Becerra was still trailing a number of candidates, including Republican Steve Hilton, who was polling at 17, Republican Chad Bianco, who was polling at 14, and Democrat Tom Steyer, who was also polling at 14. I think Becerra was tied at 10%, at least at this point, with Katie Porter. Depending on the poll, whichever poll you want to consult or whatever. But then something interesting started to happen. He suddenly started surging in the polls, and also in I think the 8-day interval after Swalwell's withdrawal, Becerra became the biggest fundraiser in the country during that interval of time that I just specified, on Act Blue, the nonprofit online fundraising platform, generally associated with small individual donations. And then by mid-May, Becerra had emerged as the frontrunner at 19%, according to an Emerson College polling Inside California Politics survey. And then by May 30th, just a couple days before the primary, Becerra had established a commanding lead, polling at 28%, according to the latest Emerson survey. And that same survey showed Democrat Tom Steyer polling at 22 and Republican Steve Hilton polling at around 21. So, gentlemen, I'm just going to open up the conversation now. What happened? I know the obvious answer is, Stillwell withdrew. Of course, that's the obvious answer. But the question remains, why didn't this bump in the polls and spike in fundraising benefit Tom Steyer or Katie Porter or one of the Republican candidates? What do you guys think? Any one of you can jump in. Go for it.
I got a couple quick thoughts. One, I think that there was a lot of concern. Folks can remember there was a lot of conversations right? Because one of the things that California did is we changed our law in terms of our primary, which just ends up taking the top two contenders, regardless of party. And I think that initially that was a strategy and there was some thinking behind it, but I don't think that strategy actually worked very well for the Democratic Party, right? And so what we saw then was so many candidates in this race and splintering the Democratic vote. You may recall there was a fear that there were going to be two Republican top contenders. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So the Democratic Party behind the scenes, I think, was very much strategizing and kind of plotting, like, which horse do we want to get behind? You know what I mean? And I believe that they took a calculated risk and placed all bets on Xavier Becerra. And Xavier Becerra was a safe bet for them. You know, he's basically a corporate shrill. You know what I mean? He's very friendly with law enforcement, and we can kind of get into it, because we've seen I kind of went in on Brown. I went on to Newsom a little bit, but what I can say is that despite some of the differences we had on some topics, they did advance police accountability legislation and sign legislation, right? And as Attorney General, Becerra, man, not only did he never ever hold any law enforcement accountable, he used his office as a bully pulpit to suppress fundamental constitutional rights like freedom of journalism. So the UC Berkeley, Department of Investigative Journalism had requested a freedom of information request from his office, and it was sent to them. And it was a list of about, I want to say, like 12,000 police officers who had been convicted of felonies, right? And they were getting ready to report that, and then all of a sudden it came to Becerra's attention, and he threatened them with criminal charges if they published that information. He said it was sent inadvertently, but why would that be sent inadvertently? That's a Freedom of Information Act. It was a public record. It was legally obtained from his office. They sent it to the journalists, and journalists have a responsibility then to report that information. There was public interest in this information because there was a lot of policy and there was a lot of conversation, public conversation happening around just how out of control police abuse was at this time. And instead, he's talking about criminalizing journalists for publicizing a list to protect criminal cops. That's what he did, right? So that was really problematic. As Attorney General, he really kind of demonstrated his prejudice. Like, I will say that race plus race, power equals racism. So I don't believe that brown people, black people can be racist, but we can be bigoted. We can be discriminatory and prejudiced. Well, Becerra, I believe, has already kind of demonstrated his anti-blackness. Robert Lewis was a black man who was on death row. He was developmentally, intellectually disabled, which means that there's laws that protect people who are intellectually disabled and prevents them from being eligible for execution in the state of California. Well, he attempted to subvert that and create a race-based adjustment, IQ adjustment, so that Robert Lewis would be eligible for the death penalty and could be executed in California. Like, that's really, really problematic, right? So when he moves on then later on to the Department of Health and Human Services, it was 80-some thousand children, 85,000 migrant children under his watch,
yes,
right? Who went missing or were lost. And these were unaccompanied minors. And there's literally voice recording of him on a phone call trying to cover it up and encouraging his office to basically just erase these young people from the record. As opposed to, when you have somebody, particularly knowing that so many of these migrant children were Latino children, brown skin, Spanish surnames, they share a cultural identity with the identity that Becerra has been campaigning on, which he talks about his parents being migrants to this country and through hard work, et cetera, right? Well, that's the story of these children and their families. You would think that if it's so personal for him and there was a vested interest and he really cared passionately, that there would have been some concern to really actually address this, to locate the missing children and to make sure that they were that they were safe, that they were healthy, right? The state had a responsibility to them, and that felt under his purview as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And instead, he tried to cover it up. So now he's running for governor. And what I saw was every, what I saw was every corporate polluter. I saw PG&E. I saw all the oil companies. I saw all the big banks and finance. And so, as much criticism as there was, which is completely understandable, because anybody who's a billionaire in this day and age has stepped on somebody to accumulate that much wealth, right? So I understand very legitimate criticism of Tom Steyer, but what you need to understand too is that the billionaires and the multi-billion multinational corporations in California that gave to the Becerra campaign have their hands so far up his ass that he's basically their personal hand puppet. So I could not in good conscience get behind Becerra, because not all skin folk is kinfolk. You know what I mean? And I'm not a cultural nationalist. I build and I support people based on values.
Interesting. Steve?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, they're legitimate points that I think that's one of the reasons why he wasn't doing so well at the beginning of his campaign when he announced his campaign. There's actually an investigation against one of his aides, and that also kind of put a lot of people in doubt, right? And a lot of people were nervous about his campaign, and plus what George is talking about, it's legit, right? I mean, look, but here's the point, though: none of these guys are perfect. You're not going to find the perfect candidate. I mean, I've been in this business for some time, right? And it's just impossible to find the perfect guy, right? The perfect candidate. All of them are going to have flaws one way or the other. Katie Porter has her flaws. Steyer has his flaws. He might have some other flaws that we don't know of because, he has billions of dollars to cover it up. Tony Thurmond might have his flaws as well. And so, so what do you do, right? Who do you vote for? When you're offered a slate of candidates, which in this case were plenty, right? And none of them are, leading in the polls. And the matter of the fact is, if they're still polling real low, yeah, there's a big opportunity, a huge opportunity for Hilton or, in this case, Chad Bianco to end up on that November ballot. So you had to do something as Democrats, and as a Democrat, I like, you have to do something, right? You have to do something. So I'm not saying that Becerra is a terrible guy, because the Becerra that I know is a very, kind man, very studious, very intelligent and intellectual. I think he takes his time. Does he do it for every single issue that's out there? I doubt it. I don't even have time to address every single issue. Plus, if you try to address every single issue will withstand your address. That's a given, right? It's like Murphy's Law. So, so when you look at Becerra and his rise, right? I think that there's a moment where you have to decide, what are we going to do as a state, as voters, as a party. And I think the decision was a correct one. It's like, okay, well, we need to choose someone and we need to help him. Eric is out of his race. He imploded. Think about someone who's not perfect, right? Eric, right? Eric Swalwell. So you have Becerra left in the race. Villaraigosa, Thurman, Katie Porter, all had a certain, imperfections, I would say. Again, Becerra too. But I think Becerra was the best of all those candidates. And so, what you see Eric's campaign imploding, and then you see that vacuum being created and those voters going to a particular candidate. In this case, Becerra. And you think, well, why? Why did those voters go to Becerra, not Steyer? Or to Villaraigosa, because of course, he's Latino, or Thurman, because Thurman is Dominicano, right? Like, why didn't they go over there? But why did they go with Becerra? And so you start digging deeper and you start understanding that there's a lot of similarities between Eric and Becerra. And I think one of the things that was pretty obvious is both of them had a experience and a history of fighting Trump. And I think Proposition 50 in this state was really, really an indicator of where California voters felt and how they felt in the sentiment. And we really were just rejecting Trump, his administration, his terrorism in the streets. I know I felt unsafe just because I'm Latino and I look Latino, right? So, people like me, I guess, really, when having the opportunity to support something like Proposition 50, went for it. And so along those lines, along that fear, right, that attack from Trump and his administration, I think a lot of people then saw the other option, a viable option, as Becerra, right? And they went with Becerra. They saw a fighter in him. They saw someone who had an impressive resume, yeah, with imperfections, albeit, but nonetheless with a very impressive resume. And they also saw someone who was willing to was willing to put up a fight in such a way that it was a steady fight. It wasn't something radical. It wasn't something far-fetched. It kind of fit into this idea of it's a smooth transition. We're doing okay. Times are tough. Times are radical times that we're dealing with. There's a war in Iran. Gas prices have gone through the roof. Groceries are through the roof. Home prices are through the roof. Home ownership is hurting. So you need some stability, and I think people were looking for that. And I think that's the reasons why a lot of voters then looked at Becerra as being the viable candidate, the candidate that many preferred. Of course, I'm not saying again he's the perfect candidate because I don't believe in a perfect candidate, but I do believe that he is the type of candidate that California needs today. That he is the candidate that he can fulfill the needs, the sentiment of voters and the wants of Californians in general today, right? Now, maybe 2 years from now, we might see a different man. He might change. I don't know, because usually candidates, when they take office and they're in office, they change, right? We've seen that many times. But
Well,
we'll
I'm
see what
actually
happens.
hoping that, discussing these vulnerabilities, I'm hoping Becerra or whoever, whatever Democrat, they're attentive to these vulnerabilities and maybe, attempt to remedy some of these issues. In a pre-production conversation, George, you mentioned that you actually preferred Steyer over Becerra. Could you say a few words about that? I mean, what is it about Steyer that you think is better?
Yeah, I could say a few words about that, but I should make it clear too that the candidate who I actually liked the most was Butch Ware,
Hmm.
the Green Party candidate. He was the one who was most aligned with me in terms of values,
Okay.
but he wasn't a viable candidate. And what I should also say is that, to Steve's point of there not being a perfect candidate, of course not, but there is a fundamental threshold and standard that I think we should hold candidates to, and I think Californians deserve better than what we currently see in this, gubernatorial race. I think it's deeply disappointing to see, how underwhelming the prospects are. You know what I mean? Because I think that actually Becerra has shown us exactly who he is, and I think that people are choosing to ignore it. Turning a blind eye to it, and I think people are going to be really profoundly disappointed if he's elected. Now, obviously, the alternative, the Republican, Hilton, would be worse. But I think folks are also sick and tired of being sick and tired. We don't want to just choose the lesser of two evils. You know what I mean? So I don't know Bissett on a personal level. I've shared some space with him. I haven't really had a lot of engagement. I should say Newsom, who I was critical of, is a freaking sweetheart. Really nice guy. So if we're judging people on just on a personality or personal level, or how cordial or friendly they are with you, then that's a different metric than actually looking at the policies that people are doing and the impact they have on our lives. You know what I'm saying? And so I don't care how, I'll vote against friends. I've had friends who run for office and I voted against them and campaigned against them when they started to steer away from the values that were important to me. You know what I mean? So, so I feel like that's an important point to make. But the other thing I need to really punctuate is I do not see my vote as an endorsement of a candidate ever. Okay. I'm call me jaded. I think I'm being realistic, but I see
Oh,
my
absolutely.
vote as
Yeah.
choosing
Mhm.
which motherfucker do I want to fight? Do I want to fight this one or that one?
Right.
Right. And
Yeah.
so when I saw Becerra, for just all the reasons I listed earlier, I'm like, well, this dude's already bought and sold. He's shown us who he is. He's basically, you know what I mean? Uh, you know, he's basically willing to cover up police, criminal cops. He's willing to do that, and he's and he's willing to take donations from every corporate interest, and he's willing to erase and cover up 85,000 missing migrant children, unaccompanied minors, right? That tells me a lot about somebody's values. So, like I said, he's shown us who he is. I can't get behind that. Steyer, on the other hand, let me start with my concerns. Well, he's a white male billionaire. Very hard for me to get behind that, and especially in this day and age. I think everybody's tired of these billionaires. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And particularly billionaires who have the audacity and just are so presumptuous that they think that they are the smartest ones in the room and that they should be basically wasting resources to buy elections. And we've seen this happen all across the country. It's become a trend. Billionaires have gone from trying to buy politicians and puppets to now actually inserting themselves into office, right? And so that's hard for me to get behind too. But what I will say is this: in the spectrum of billionaires, I've engaged with Tom Steyer, also a sweetheart, also a really nice guy. But I also pay attention to the actions. And his actions have been that he's actually contributed a tremendous amount of resources to climate change, environmental justice, and criminal justice reform. I'm a part of, our national movement of formerly incarcerated people and activists. We, FICPFM, I'm on the board of. We hosted a Democratic primary forum for presidential candidates when Tom Steyer was running for president. So I had an opportunity to kind of meet and interface with him then. And then he reached out to me, I'd say in 2020, and invited me to co-author an op-ed piece with him that was published in the Sacramento Bee about police accountability, based on the advocacy work and organizing I had been doing with impacted families and around policy at the legislature. So I've seen that he at least has some alignment with my values, and because he was he was basically paying for his own campaign. He wasn't necessarily selling out to special interests. He spent more money than anybody, but he was the most viable candidate that felt there was some political alignment with, So Butch Ware was the person who had the most values alignment with me, wasn't a viable candidate, right? Katie Porter wasn't necessarily that viable. And, and the word on the street about Katie is that she's just a really mean person. I haven't interfaced with her, but I think a bunch of us did see sort of that, the B-roll of or not even necessarily B-roll, but the hot mic.
Oh yeah,
an interview,
YouTube video, yeah.
And we've heard from all her former staff that she's kind of abusive. Like when she has a little power over folks, that she can be very verbally and just kind of abusive and authoritarian with folks. So to me, those are indicators, particularly when we're dealing with this age of authoritarianism and fascism, that it's hard for me to get behind. I would have loved if Xavier Becerra actually was values aligned. I would have loved to get behind and seen, a Latino governor, or Tony Thurmond, a black governor. You know what I mean? And I know Tony as well. I actually live in his district when he was from Assembly, and I've engaged with him. Also a sweetheart and a nice guy. And I think he's done a decent job as superintendent of state schools. But I haven't seen him, in my opinion, be bold enough, take bold positions. And I think that's where people are at right now. People are tired of the playbook, the usual playbook of politicians, right? Which I think Becerra kind of epitomizes, right? He represents the safe playbook that Democrats, it's basically MAGA light at this point. It's like a kinder, gentler fascism. You know what I mean? You're not necessarily opposed to fascism, but maybe that form of fascism, maybe a kinder, gentler one. And you're a corporatist, you know what I mean? So you'll sell out the environment, but you'll talk out of both sides of your face. You'll say the right thing publicly, but your policies will reflect something else. You know what I mean? And that's the kind of DNC that we're seeing. And of course, AIPAC money and trying to erase a genocide that's happening in Gaza right now. And this is why I think the Democratic Party is fundamentally flawed, because they have alienated authentic progressives, young voters, a whole bunch of people who are going to make or break an election.
We will not disagree with you there.
We cannot get excited. No. We cannot get excited about a candidate.
I agree,
No, I've got 10,000 stories about that. Yeah. Let me ask you real quick, though. If it
Yeah.
comes down to Hilton and Becerra, which way are you going?
Well, obviously it ain't Hilton, man. I wish that I had
Yeah,
more options than that. You know what I mean? But
right,
I told you my strategy. It's not an endorsement. It's me
right.
selecting who I'm going to fight. But at this point, I also just see that there'll be so many fights with Becerra, it's going to frankly be
Oh
exhausting.
yeah.
So
And
it's
let me tell
really hard
you,
to feel like there's even going to be any really point of
yeah.
interest where we're going to really actually, see eye to eye and be able to, have some common ground. I just don't see it
Yeah.
at this point.
The primary was challenging for Becerra. I think we can all agree, right? But the runoff is going to be a fucking war between Becerra and California on the one side and Hilton and Trump on the other. So knives are out for Becerra. MAGA is coming for him.
I mean, they're still
This
counting
is,
votes. Where are they
yeah,
at? About
true.
30% right
And
now?
that's another thing I wanted to mention. You know what?
30%? I
There's a
don't think we
lot
should be
of
jumping to
mail-in
conclusions
votes.
yet.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point to make because there's a lot of mail-in ballots still out there, and a lot of people were voting strategically. This is a different election. But this is going to be a national race at some level. Becerra's
It
going to
is.
be a target.
Yeah.
He checks a lot of boxes for Trump. Mexican American, check. California, check. And probably, Biden administration, check, check, check. I mean, they're coming for him. So what it's going to turn into, Becerra is going to be running against Trump in many ways. And I think that's a strategy that Becerra should employ. Hilton's a Trump, you know, bootlicking lackey. And so he needs to hammer that point in, and just let everybody know this is about him versus Trump. And in a place like California, I think that's going to be an effective strategy. So guys, I was wondering if I could just pivot the conversation at this point and sort of switch over to a discussion about California Governor Gavin Newsom. We started talking about him much earlier.
Sure. Before we pivot, could I just say
Sure.
one more
No,
thing, man? Because I
absolutely.
think that this has
Yeah.
been brought up and we haven't necessarily discussed it yet. And
Yes.
this is why I think this was also fundamentally flawed in terms of the Democratic Party once again pushing their thumb on the scale for a particular candidate, right? As opposed to just allowing an organic process to occur, among Democratic candidates. And that's that whether it's erroneous or credible, I think what we can safely assume is that because Becerra's chief of staff and another former staffer are already being indicted and investigated, right, for embezzlement and misappropriation of funds. Like I said, whether it's credible or not, I think we can assume, particularly the pattern of the Trump administration, that they are going to indict him. They are going to come after him using the
Mhm.
Department of Justice. And
Yes.
and I don't think they would have been able to do that with Steyer.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
That's
The thing
something.
is,
Yeah.
look, the
Mhm.
reality is, and you're right. I mean, they're still counting votes, but I mean, if you look at the marks that both of these candidates were trying to reach, I think the one that's already reached those marks is Becerra. I'm not saying that Becerra is a better candidate for that, but
Right.
I'm just pointing at the mathematical evidence here and at the numbers. He is leading Steyer by a good amount of votes. And he is carrying some of the very important counties in California, LA being one of them, and Orange County being the second one. So when you look at that, it's like, okay, he has a significant lead there. Where is Steyer going to come up with enough votes to surpass both Hilton and everyone else? Um, I just don't see it mathematically possible, right? Probabilities are that you're going to end up with Hilton and Becerra on that November
I think you're
ballot.
probably right, and I'm still holding out some hope, man. I think we've seen a few things that have shocked folks, and that's one of the things about the mail-in ballot that it's really difficult to predict. I'm a political animal. You would think I would have been the first one to throw my ballot in the mail and make sure it got in early. And I'm also a professional procrastinator. I'm a procrastinator. I got mine in, Tuesday in the afternoon. You know what I'm saying? And had to deliver it directly to the ballot box. You know what I'm saying? So my point just being is even someone who's a political animal like me who waits to the last minute, you just never know what's going to happen. So right now, I think that there are about 30, maybe 30%, a little over 30%. A lot can mathematically anything's possible, but looking at what's come in so far, yeah, I think you're probably right. We're looking at a Hilton, Becerra,
Yeah, there's
runoff.
been a lot of talk about, strategic voting this election, and it's just people waiting to see who the viable candidate's going to be and then casting their votes. So this is an unusual, primary, I think. So we'll see. You're right. It's going to take about a month to certify everything. We'll see what develops.
Yeah.
You never know,
Yeah.
right? You
Yeah,
just never
and you know
know.
what? And I agree. I mean, everything's
Yeah,
possible, right? Everything's possible.
sure.
Is it probable though? The probabilities of something happening,
Yeah, at
it's
some point,
unlikely.
mathematically, it just doesn't seem likely.
Yeah.
You're right. So guys, uh, as of June 4th, 2026, Gavin Newsom has not formally announced a run for president in 2028, but he is widely regarded as a likely contender and one of the leading potential Democratic candidates, at least at some, by some people. Okay. Um, how do you guys feel? And we discussed Newsom earlier, but how do you feel about Newsom running for president? I mean, what are your thoughts on him running for president? And if not Newsom, then who at this
Newsom
point?
represents everything that I just kind of described earlier in terms of
Hmm.
Becerra and in terms of the fundamentally flawed formula that the DNC uses as far as what's safe. And what they call centrist is actually not centrist. They're not moderate Dems. They're not mod Dems. They're condems, conservative Democrats who condemn anything progressive. And they get in the way of anything that we're trying to advance that's going to actually, advance social justice, racial justice, and the things that really matter to working families. You know what I mean? So it's yeah, I'm just not excited about him as a presidential candidate. Going back to Steve's point earlier that every candidate is flawed, understanding that every candidate is flawed, I would love to see AOC throw her hat in the ring. You know what I mean? At least, I think there's more political alignment, and she's someone I would rather fight when she's in the Oval Office than Newsom, because I think then I can strategically pick and choose some battles. You know what I mean? And and we might even make some headway on some of those with her and and it certainly, I'm glad it wasn't Hillary, but I was sad that that who Hillary lost to. You know what I mean?
Right.
But it would be amazing to have our first woman president be a brown woman too. You know what I'm saying?
Steve?
Yeah, no, I think about Newsom and I think about what he's done here in California. There's just some policies that he supported that are just, totally against what I believe. Healthcare wise, he has underfunded the Medi-Cal and has left out any folks that are undocumented. So they have to pay. So they have to pay a fee. They have to pay for their coverage if they're undocumented. And I don't, that's definitely something that is not necessarily what I believe in. He could have made cuts somewhere else, but he decided to make the cuts there on the Medi-Cal. But hey, look, here's the thing though. The man has a national presence. He's out there. He represents California. He represents the resistance. He represents the fight against Trump. And so you can't take that away from him, right? And he's built that image intentionally. But yeah, there's a lot of things I don't agree with. I mean, one of the things I definitely didn't agree with was when he had on his podcast show Charlie Kirk.
I was about to say that. Yeah.
That was
and then Steve Bannon.
I was going to mention that.
Oh,
yes.
what the monkey?
No, that was
why would
just,
you do that?
about,
right? Why would you do that? And then say on the show, right, when he interviewed Charlie Kirk, that his son was like a big fan.
What's wrong with your son?
Why would you allow your son to be watching that guy, right?
Yeah, no.
So,
absolutely. That's exactly what I was going to mention.
It is just, I'm so confused. I mean,
yes.
Why would you do that? But at the same time, I have to, we have to realize he hasn't really thrown his hat officially into the race because he hasn't declared. But we all know that that's what he intends to do, or most likely. The man does have that advantage. He has some national recognition. His name is out there. He has curb appeal. He looks younger, stronger than Trump. Not that he's going to run against Trump, by the way, guys. He'll be running against perhaps J.D. Vance or Rubio. Who knows, right? But the fact that he portrays himself as the resistance right now, I think he's gathering a lot of followers. But again, a lot of flaws as well. A lot of flaws as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, at one point I was kind of enthusiastic about Newsom, you know, in terms of just him being a viable candidate. You know, I'm never crazy about any, there's really nobody out there that inspires me. But in the aftermath of Biden's disastrous debate in, I think it was late June of 2024, you know, he showed some poise, he showed some integrity in the days and weeks that followed. You know, he continued to defend Biden publicly, even while other Democrats were kind of coming for him or whatever. Um, but you know, he kept like kind of, you know, people kept trying to position him as the alternative, and he kept kind of rejecting that. I thought that showed a little bit of class, and you know, there's slim pickings. So you know, you're looking for anything. I'll just say that right now. So I thought, okay, well, here's some integrity. I thought
It wasn't class or integrity. It was strategy. I
and
want
possibly
to
that, and that was it.
Strategy, because it would have made him look really like a real asshole to
Right.
be ready to just throw this old man under
Yeah.
the bus, and so he could opportunistically climb to a new office. So it was strategy.
Right.
Let's keep it real.
But just like you said, Steve, you know, he was sort of the heir apparent for a while, but then he invited fucking Charlie Kirk on his podcast, and just gushing over him, and not to challenge him. You know, it's like, you know, there's this narrative. Oh, I want to reach out and talk to the other side. What's wrong with you people? You know, you're against us. I just want to debate. I just want to, you know, have a conversation. He didn't, that wasn't a conversation. That was you gushing over the guy, right? Then he had Steve
and then he
Bannon.
was agreeing with him too.
Yes,
and many things that he
with
said
everything
was
he
agreeing.
said.
Right.
And then he had Steve Bannon, and Bannon walked all over him. Basically, at some point, he reiterated the claim that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. Newsom didn't even respond. He kept going. He let that claim stand. I don't know. I went back and listened to it. Didn't say a goddamn thing about it. So for me, you know, he's just one of those guys, just too quick to capitulate. You know, took a knee almost immediately. Kind of the Bill Maher type. You know what I mean? And others. There's a lot of them running around these days. But anyways.
I'll just jump in and say that it goes back to the statement I made earlier, man, that there's a kinder, gentler fascism that they're trying to approach. And this kind of like, let's reach over the aisle. At this point, this isn't even about partisan politics. Let's be very real, which is why I'm not a gung-ho Democrat. At this point, I'm really frustrated with the duopoly. And I think a lot of folks are, you know, but what we know is that the opposition at this part has become a cult. A right-wing white supremacist, a right-wing extremist, white supremacist cult. And
thank you for saying that.
With an agenda of hate.
Yes.
And so to actually try to reach across the aisle to try to find common ground with that, like what common ground are you going to find?
There is none.
I mean, Charlie Kirk, you know, there's all this revisionist history now that he's, you know, now that he's been assassinated, right? Now that he's been killed. And yet, you know, everybody remembers how dismissive he was of school shootings and everything else. Every time someone was beaten by police, his response was, well, they just should have complied. Well, you know what? All those who were sad about his murder, Charlie Kirk should have ducked. You know what I mean? As far as I'm concerned, right? So, you know, like, really no sympathy whatsoever, because the guy spewed hate, perpetuated hate, and the fact that Gavin Newsom would try to actually kowtow to that just is disgusting too, and tells me that he's really just not principled. You know what I mean? You know, he'll do whatever he thinks it will take to win.
Yeah, and Steve, you're my witness here. I think every single episode that we've done, I've gone back to the fact that MAGA is premised in white supremacy.
Definitely.
I don't even see this as a political calculus. I see it as ethnic conflict.
Don't need to sugarcoat it.
You know, especially in places like Texas and the Southwest. This is ethnic conflict, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, you know, people are like, well, no, it has not. It has something to do with immigration, but that's not.
Let's talk about who the real immigrants are. We didn't
Right.
cross the border. The border
Right.
crossed us. We're rooted to this land by our indigenous
Absolutely.
grandmothers. They're the ones who came over here on boats. They're the original so-called quote unquote wetbacks. You know what I mean? So
Yes.
let's be real about it. No one is illegal on stolen land. And the audacity of them to call anybody illegal.
Mhm.
Right.
No, absolutely.
Totally agree with George
Yeah.
on that. I mean, it just, you
Yeah.
know, it's the audacity, it's this hate also towards, anyone that's brown or black. And we just have to fight that. I mean, there's no other way
Right.
to fight it.
Yeah.
And that's one thing about Newsom. Look,
There's no
he
issue
did
that's going
call
to
out
trump this
he
calculus.
did say, let's fight fire with fire. I mean, he called it out, right? And it's and in a way,
Yeah.
and you know,
By inviting them on his podcast, that's not fire with fire.
well,
Come on, man.
that was after, yeah, that was before. Yeah.
that was a miscalculated strategy.
Yeah, I think what he was trying to do is get some some traction with his podcast,
Mhm.
and he didn't realize that he didn't need those fools. But he did put him on there, so it's terrible what he did. It tells you about his character. You're right, man. I mean, I'm not gonna justify his actions. I mean, I don't know if he ends up running for president, if I'm going to support him or I'm going to support someone else. I think there's other candidates that I have to look at. I haven't seen others willing to throw their names into the game, but we'll see. We'll see. I mean, AOC, maybe. Bernie Sanders, even though he's up there in age.
Yeah, Bernie's ancient. I think people are tired.
Yeah, Bernie's ancient,
dinosaurs
yeah.
trying to
At
run
some
for
point,
office, man.
there's a conversation about viability that needs to be had. And
Yeah,
so
that
that's, it's complicated, right, guys?
Yeah. Well,
Anyways, yeah, let's take one more break and we will be right back with our final segment called Drug of Choice. You are listening to Vanguard Elements.
You are listening to Vanguard Elements, the alternative Mexican-American voice of the Southwest. The views and opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the individual expressing those views and opinions, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any affiliated organization, employer, or institution. Thank you for supporting independent Mexican-American media.
Welcome back. You're listening to Vanguard Elements. So we have a segment on this podcast which we call Drug of Choice, in which each of the panel members recommend or discuss a news story, Substack, podcast, what any item that they happen to be tracking at the time. And I like to explain the title of this segment so people don't think that we're promoting illicit drug use. I don't know. Maybe we are promoting illicit. Who knows? Anyways, we're all kind of information and news junkies, so it's just a reference to that. Anyways, George, would you like to go first? What story, issue, podcast are you currently tracking?
Yeah, so recently there were local news reports here in the Bay Area as a result a 16-year-old Black high school student in Fairfield who was beaten on school campus by a Fairfield police officer, Bianca Camacho. And he wasn't necessarily, there was a fight on campus that he wasn't involved in. He wasn't confrontational. He wasn't violent. He wasn't anything. But he was punched repeatedly in the face in what Fairfield Police Department then tried to describe as quote unquote distraction strikes, which doesn't really exist. It was a term initially coined by former LA Police Chief William Bradford, right, who then rolled it back because it actually ended up creating so many problems and making them vulnerable to litigation, right? But for those who don't remember William Bradford, he was also a national consultant in really trying to advise police departments on how to, I guess you could say, just blatantly be more abusive. And he has this whole kind of broken windows theory of law enforcement, meaning that if you go after people for just even minor infractions, that somehow you're going to prevent bigger crimes from occurring down the road, right? So, really problematic approach, right? Well, what we began to kind of see, unfortunately, was a little bit of a wedge between some folks in the so-called Latino community who, because she was a Latina police officer, were defending her actions. And I think a lot of that was driven by anti-Blackness. And so I followed, and I also spoke out at the press conference and the rally before the city council meeting, because I think it's really important for folks to understand that divide and conquer, classic divide and conquer, is how they've been able to maintain white supremacy and subordinate us, right? And, you know, the two populations most impacted by police abuse and police violence in California are Black and brown. So we have a common pain, we have a common oppression, therefore we have a common struggle. But more importantly, we also have a common humanity and a common spirit. And I'm fundamentally, you know, I believe our destinies are inextricably linked. They are intertwined. And how we're able to build authentic Black and brown solidarity, I think, is going to predict what kind of future we have. Because guess what? This July 4th, they're getting ready to celebrate 250 years of what? Colonialism and terrorism against Black and brown communities, right? And let's be real about it. We are, you know, Latino is not a racial identity, it's an ethnic identity made up predominantly of indigenous and African diaspora. And of course, there's the European influence, but they also created a one-drop rule, which said if you had one drop of Black or indigenous blood, then you were no longer white, you no longer benefited from white privilege. And while that caste system, that racialized caste system, has sort of shifted over time based on colorism and phenotype and some of those variables, it still kind of continues, right? And so it's important for us to really think about what will the next 250 years look like from day one. On July 5th, 2026, what kind of futures are we trying to create for Black and brown people, for everybody that's been oppressed and everybody that's been stepped on by this agenda? You know what I mean? For women, for LGBTQ, for everybody who has been oppressed by this system. So I've been paying attention to this story. I've inserted myself and I've been getting involved. And I think, you know, similarly to the same reason why I wouldn't necessarily get behind Becerra, but I saw plenty of my friends who did. I think it's really important for us to never, ever fall into the trap of cultural nationalism, that we align ourselves with values. You know what I mean? Like I've said before, and it's been said, and it'll be said again, not all skin folk is kinfolk. You know what I mean? And I really think that Black and brown solidarity is really going to pave the way to a better future for all of us.
Interesting.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to talk about something like the opposite, but not really. Look, I think it's important also to have some understanding and some knowledge, some cognitive awareness, I guess, if you want to call it, about what's going on in the world. And, I think the best issue or conflict that's out there that I think we all should be paying attention to is what's going on between Ukraine and Russia. And so there's this great podcast called The Ukraine, the Latest. And it is sponsored by The Telegraph. It's a British media platform or media company. And they do a great job at reporting what's going on the ground in Ukraine and Russia. They talk about the war. They give you updates. But I think what they also do, and I really appreciate this, is that they keep the human story front and center. They talk about human beings and the suffering of human beings, and they share their story and the story of those that they invite on the program to really emphasize that there is no winners in the war, right? And I think that's important because one way or the other, I think we all should be taking notes, right? Do we want to end up fighting each other here in the country? Do we want to end up fighting others? And is that the path? So I think that's important. That's the one podcast that I'm following. But I'm also following on more on the personal side. This has nothing to do with news, but I'm going to make the recommendation. I think also the fact that we maintain a spiritual and mental health is very important. And I try to do that by listening to several podcasts that talk about meditation. And just, it's interesting because I ran into one about a guru that was talking about, and this is obviously common, this is out there, but he was talking about, you want to change the world, you need to change yourself, right? And so I think it's a very important that you start with the man in the mirror. So, going back, reaffirming that, a refresher on that is very helpful. It's a daily pill. So anyone out there, I do recommend, there's plenty of podcasts that touch on that. So I'm not going to guide anyone to a specific one, but yeah. So those are my two drugs of choice. Back to you, man.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I'm tracking the situation with the Alamo plan in San Antonio. And I'm hoping at some point I can even maybe devote an entire podcast episode. I've written several articles about this topic. And basically what's going on is that Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and allies and Republican, Trump allies, are really trying to sanitize the story of the Texas Revolt and the Alamo. They're trying to scrub the historical narrative clean of any reference to the institution of slavery. And I think that the Texas Revolt was one of the greatest distortions of history anywhere at any given time. They're trying to turn the Texas Revolt into sort of like a Disney movie. And the latest troubling development, and there are many associated with the project, occurred on April 7th when Patrick announced that he had selected some dude named Taylor Sheridan to produce and direct a film depicting the Battle of the Alamo to eventually be featured at the new Alamo Visitor Center and Museum. Now, I don't know if you guys know who Sheridan is, but he's this American screenwriter, director, and producer. I guess he's created Yellowstone and some other associated Paramount productions, including, I think, Dutton Ranch is his latest. And it's set in South Texas. I've always said that Mexico should be commended for confronting the expansion of slavery. And that's really all that the Texas Revolt was about. They're going to try to turn it into this story about these noble American, settlers showed up in Texas, and then the evil Mexicans, because of their tyranny or whatever, they rose up for freedom, and that's the language they're trying to use to describe the Texas Revolt, and they want no mention of slavery. And so for me, that's a cause for concern, because, and I'm not the one saying this. This is backed up by many pieces of historical analysis, but the Texas Revolt should be considered the first episode of the American Civil War. Okay, so
Wow.
this is the first pro-slavery rebellion, and I think that Mexico should be commended for taking a principled stand against this. The trajectory of American history would have been radically different if they had been able to prevail in Texas. It would have certainly, impeded efforts to spread the institution of slavery throughout what is now the United States.
That's
But
right. Could I piggyback on that a
oh
little
no,
bit, Joe?
absolutely,
I've been
yes.
following that story a little bit as well. I
Mhm.
happened to be in San Antonio, Texas for the Knox
Hmm.
conference this year as a
Okay.
presenter, and I got to visit with some of my relatives. So my tío Isaac Cardenas, Papa Bear, who is the
Mhm.
medicine man, spiritual leader for the Tapilam Coahuitecos, the indigenous
Hmm.
people of San Antonio, right? And so I recall as I was having lunch with him, and then afterwards meeting with the tribal chair, Ramon Juan Vasquez, that in the middle of our conversation, they had to mobilize to a meeting because of everything that you just described. But I wanted to just say the importance too of really centering the indigenous perspective,
Mhm.
of our Coahuiteco, our Tapilam relatives from that area, who are already sort of erased, you know what I
Right.
mean? And are, at risk of further erasure. They're
Right.
not even federally recognized as a tribe, right? Because federal recognition means you get permission from the colonizer, right? That
Mhm.
somehow you are legitimate, you are credible. It has nothing to do with your ancestry. It has nothing to do who your ancestors were, your tradition, your culture, your language. They have all of those things. They have their ceremonies. They have everything intact. All of the criteria to be a recognized tribe. But the federal government won't acknowledge them because of everything that you just described.
Yeah, that's interesting because the former president of the Alamo Trust Incorporated, this is the nonprofit that's sort of been tasked with renovating the Alamo. She was forced to resign by Patrick, and one of the factors that led to her problems with Patrick was that she wanted to recognize and observe Indigenous Peoples Day. So that was one of the many complaints he had about her. His biggest complaint was that she, in her dissertation at the University of Southern California, she included references to this book called Forget the Alamo that clearly places the cause of the Texas Revolt as the Mexican government trying to stop the sort of the institution of slavery in Texas. And it's complicated. You know, there are many things to consider when discussing this particular situation. But as Mexican Americans, I think we all need to step up at this point and make sure that an accurate rendering of the Texas Revolt is we need to ensure an accurate rendering of the Texas Revolt. So
literally, when you mentioned the Forget the Alamo book,
mm-hmm.
They gave me that book before we left.
Really?
So I was looking for it, just as you were saying the title. I was looking like, do I have my copy? Is it right here? Can I hold it up? But everybody should read that book.
Yeah,
and it's not the first done in cooperation with the Tapilam Coahuiltecos.
Yeah, great book. But to be honest with you, it's not the first book to cite slavery as a
Rudy Acuna, right? The late Rudy Acuna, the late great one of the godfathers of Chicano Chicana studies.
I had the privilege
of Occupied America.
Yes, he signed my copy of Occupied America. I had the privilege of actually hearing him talk. Yeah,
it's been written about for sure.
Yeah,
we
need to honor Rudy Acuna because he passed recently.
That's
and
right.
One of the things I was thinking about is maybe doing an episode and dedicating it to him and just sort of discussing his life and his significance.
Yeah,
I mean, his amazing legacy. Like I said, I had the privilege of listening to him in the 90s. He was giving a talk, and he signed my copy of Occupied America. But that's not his only book. He has many books. But
another legend who just passed away, but also an unsung hero.
Mm-hmm.
We may consider a future show about is Magdaleno, Rose Avila. So a giant in our movement. For folks who don't know, Google his name, but he just passed a few weeks ago. His memorial's coming up. He was a near dear friend and mentor, and he was one of these Chicanos, also like Betita Martinez, that was erased from a lot of the history books, but he was out there marching with Dr. King. He was involved in the Chicano movement. He was involved in the farm workers movement, and was one of those folks who I think, because of the sort of canonization of Cesar Chavez, was very much erased because of their leadership and because of their criticism for not organizing and including migrant farm workers in the early days of the farm worker movement. So Magdaleno Rose Avila, another giant we just lost.
Sounds interesting.
Wow.
Very good.
Look them up, yeah.
Well, guys, I'm going to go ahead and leave the conversation there for now. Thank you both. It was a very interesting conversation, and hope we can talk again soon, guys. Have a great night.
All right, everybody. Have a good night.
See you guys. Take care, guys.
Peace and taco grease, y'all. Peace and taco grease.
Sale vale, bro. All right. Take care.
You have been listening to Vanguard Elements, the alternative Mexican-American voice of the Southwest. For additional information, please follow us on X at SolidarityWMEX or visit our website at solidaritywithmexico.org. Please also check out our affiliated online publication, Fronterizo Magazine, at fronterizonews.com. Thank you for supporting independent Mexican-American media.